George R.R. Martin is my favorite author of all time. His works have redefined my life in ways too numerous to list, and this goes beyond just A Song of Ice and Fire, which is obviously my favorite work of his. I read another one of his novels, Fever Dream, pretty recently, and I quite liked that. I love a lot of his older short stories, specifically For a Single Yesterday is my favorite of them, as I referenced in a recent video on John Connington. But beyond that, his larger work inspires more than you might think. If you like Dungeons and Dragons or Baldur's Gate 3, you'd be surprised to know that George R. R. Martin actually coined the term Githyanki, which is a very important kind of group of people, ancestry in D&D's Forgotten Realms setting and in that game. And I was very surprised to learn that George R. R. Martin influenced something that I very recently watched. Specifically, parts of the Peacemaker Season 2 finale are inspired by an old comic pitch by George R. R. Martin, and today I wanted to discuss exactly what that is. I really like Peacemaker. I loved the first season back in, I think it was 2021 when it came out. I love James Gunn's work generally. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is my favorite superhero movie, and I think Peacemaker did a great job establishing this kind of background joke player as a serious character in his own right, and exploring his kind of depths and trauma and everything there, while building up this kind of larger cast. Season 2 of Peacemaker, I would say, is more of a mixed bag. I think overall it has stronger emotional through lines and arcs, but there are a lot of ideas therein that do come off as half baked, and I think it's less of a cohesive singular image when compared to the first season as just kind of a journey in and of itself. That aside, after the season 2 finale, which has had a fairly mixed reception online, I was looking through discussion and this one name kept coming up. Salvation Run. Apparently, it was a comic arc that is going to be a part of the DCU's future going forward. I am not as familiar with the comics as I should be. I love some comics. I haven't read a ton since The Walking Dead ended, but I wanted to go and look into what this arc entailed and what exactly it was setting up. I was very surprised to find that this arc was originally pitched by my favorite author. This project has a pretty interesting history. Salvation Run is a canonical run of comics in DC's history. With that said, it was not always intended as such. That canonical run of comics focuses on this effectively alternative planet that the Earth is using as this storage, kind of supermax prison facility for DC's metahuman supervillains. And it leads to this big arc of essentially Lex Luthor versus the Joker. All of this stuff happens, they end up eventually escaping. However, that was not always the case. Decades before this actually came into print as an actual DC comic, it was pitched as an idea by George R. R. Martin and John Joss, who collaborated to create this idea. Back then, it was supposed to be a part of DC's Elseworlds series, which is effectively Marvel's What If, kind of their version of that. So it was never intended to be canon, and from what I understand, all of these plot lines that happened within Salvation Run specifically in the published comics are not specific to Martin's vision that was pitched way back when, and Joss's as well. And I think it's worth noting that James Gunn, the guy who's obviously written Peacemaker, directed Peacemaker, and is kind of the visionary for the larger DCU, has said while they are doing Salvation as a concept, they are not bringing over stuff from that specific run of comics as they were canonically printed in DC. So that, in my mind, makes it seem as though we're going to go back to maybe some more of Martin's ideas. As that very much makes sense, as at this point, Lex Luthor is obviously still on Earth in the DCU, and the Joker isn't established at all. It's unclear if Robert Pattinson Batman is going to be the actual DC Batman. He probably is, but regardless, he doesn't have a Joker, and if we don't even have a Batman, we definitely don't have a Joker. Martin actually wrote a not a blog post back in 2007 when this comic run was announced, as it was publicly said that this was an idea kind of plucked from the mind of George R. R. Martin. He wanted to set the record straight and give credit to his co-writer, John Joss, as I previously mentioned, and beyond that, he gave further insight into both how this idea initially took shape and how his vision of this concept differs from what DC was actually putting into practice in the published comics. I'd like to quote a few paragraphs from that aforementioned blog post, as I think they're very insightful on this idea and what it was to Martin. Quote, In the beginning, it wasn't Salvation Run either. The origins of this go back a decade. At the time, DC was publishing a line of books called Elseworlds, their version of Marvel's What If stories, tales that took place outside the ongoing DC continuity. The editor of the line was a fellow by the name of Andy Helfer. The idea that John and I pitched him way back then can be summed up in one word: Australia. What if the world finally got sick of all of these supervillains and decided to get rid of them once and for all by transporting them to a distant planet with no way home? Our title was Exiles in Paradise. Andy loved it and bought it, and John and I set to work on what was originally supposed to be a 10-issue series. It was an Elseworld series from day one, however, a what if story. When Britain sent convicts to Australia, they were transported for the term of your natural life, and that was the premise for our story too. There was no escape. This planet was in another galaxy, millions of light years away, only accessible by boom tube. We wanted to tell a story that would span decades. Characters would die, would change, would marry, would have children. Wars would be fought, but eventually, from the chaos and brutality of the early days, a society would be born. Some of the villains would find only death in the new world, but for others it would be a second chance. They would find redemption. The whole tale, once told, would span decades. None of the villains would ever return to Earth, nor would they have to. This was an Elseworlds series. Martin then details what happened to the project and why it ended up fully getting shelved at a point. To continue quoting, the project began well enough. Barry Kittenson was assigned to do the art, and John and I plotted the first issue and wrote the script. And Kitson did the pencils, and did a terrific job, too. After that, however, problems developed. Creative differences, quote unquote, as they say in Hollywood. As we plotted out the second issue, it became clear that the story John and I wanted to tell was a good deal darker and grittier than what Andy Helfer was comfortable with. A dozen villains died in issue 1 alone, some of them name villains, and that was just to start. There was murder, there was sex, there were even porta potties, which became a big issue somehow. We found ourselves unable to resolve those differences, so finally a settlement was reached and Exiles in Paradise was shelved. So it is very interesting. We've heard in terms of this adaptation of Salvation Run, which was once Exile in Paradise, this is going to be kind of going into the main future of the DCU. It'll be addressed in the next big movie, Man of Tomorrow, I believe it's called, or I believe the next big movie after A Woman of Tomorrow, which is the Supergirl movie, if I remember correctly. I am unfortunately not a DC expert, but it is interesting to examine because it does seem like characters are going to have to return from Salvation at this point, which is this paradise planet where they're going to store all of these supervillains. Spoilers for Peacemaker Season 2, if you don't want those, click off now. Like the video as well if you're clicking off, but regardless, Peacemaker is stranded there at the end of the second season, and I have to believe he's going to come back at some point because I really want him to. And additionally, I think it would make sense for the story, and I can't see Gunn kind of stranding one of his core characters there forever. With that said, I could see Gunn pulling in more elements that Martin had initially envisioned. These issues of it being too gritty don't seem like they would really apply to the DCU, especially if it were covered in one of the shows like Peacemaker, where pretty much everything can be said and shown. I think there's potential for some really interesting stories in this space, specifically if we don't focus entirely on the concept of escape, getting off of this other world, as that will be important. There are characters on Salvation who will undoubtedly need to return to Earth to play in those stories at certain points, but I do think it could be really fascinating to have some project that is this original Exiles in Paradise idea, maybe even called that, where we see villains going in and a bunch dying initially and then rebuilding some society, or people grow and change or stay the same. It's a really fun idea, and I do think it's really interesting to see Martin's ideas impacting larger stories that he really hasn't had anything to do with in decades at this point. I'd love to hear his opinion on Salvation being used in the DCU. I thought it might be brought up at Comic-Con, but nobody mentioned it at the panel, so it is a shame. I'd love to hear his thoughts in an interview at some point in the near future. It's also worth noting, while we don't know what exactly was in that initial pitch, James Gunn most likely does, given his current high-up status at DC. And now that I've thought about it a little bit, I honestly think Gunn is a really, really great person to adapt any work of George R.R. Martin's. When I think about those two as creative, the main thing that leaps to my mind is that their works are defined by heart and by character. I think that James Gunn has shown that he is able able to adapt even kind of the loosest source material into something that is emotionally sound and resident with a massive audience. And I think that's something that Martin's worlds and adaptations largely haven't seen, at least as far as A Song of Ice and Fire goes. So yeah, I'm really excited to see where this goes, and hopefully Martin speaks on it at some point in the future. This video is very different from my usual fare, but if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. I have many more videos on A Song of Ice and Fire for you in the near future. This is not turning into a DC channel. I just thought it would be fun to talk about kind of the impacts of my favorite author in areas that are not my favorite series. So yeah, if you enjoyed this and want to see more similar stuff, let me know in the comments. And yeah, I'll have many more videos for you soon. Thank you again for watching. Goodbye, everyone.